Lost Private. We're in Normandy.
Welcome everyone to episode 55 of the We're Not Lost Private podcast. I'm your host, Joe Muccia. And man, the last three shows have just been really well received, and the quality of the guests have been fantastic, starting off with Claire Mully, and then having Reg on, and then the roundtable with Reg and Woody. Thanks so much for everyone for the comments about the shows. Really enjoyed doing them, and thanks for checking back in for this latest episode. A little bit of housekeeping, just a reminder to everyone, we are on Patreon. If you are interested in supporting the pod, there's a tier for you. We have three different tiers for monetary support if you want to pledge something to help keep the pod going. I do want to thank John and Nessa and David, Philip, and Francois for becoming members of the team. Thank you so much. You can find us on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, Buzzsprout, Spotify, all the podcast catchers that are out there. You can find us on. There's always an easy way to find this pod on something. But anyway, I want to get down to business with this particular one. This episode is going to be on the D+1 battle for Vierville, and it involves tankers of the 746th Independent Tank Battalion of the U.S. Army and the 506 Parachute Infantry Regiment. I know we have a lot of fans of the pod that love to have stories about the Currahys in there, so they're going to get their full value today. I am going to work off a script a little bit because there is some direct quotes here from a lot of the participants that I don't want to mess up, and I think everybody will find it interesting. A couple years back, I actually did this show. I did a version of this on Woody's World War II TV, but over those interviewing years, I was able to locate more information and find more interviews of folks that were involved in this particular fight, and I thought it could really do a good product improved version of this. So I hope everybody will enjoy it. It is, again, expanded beyond what I had presented previously. So you will find some new stuff in here if you've heard that podcast. Also, I will recommend afterwards, there's a companion show on Woody's channel on Dead Man's Corner by Niels Henkemans. I would check that out as well. It's a good follow-up to this show because they are interrelated due to the nature of the stories. But with that said, will also be presenting a slideshow, but you're not going to have to watch this in order to enjoy the show, because this will be pretty descriptive. So I hope everybody will hang in there with me. First and foremost, you really have to look at this in the framework of the airborne plan and the subsequent landings. I've presented this before in several other pods where you kind of get a good feel of the plan especially for the 101st Airborne on D-Day and where they're supposed to go, and specifically the 506th. They were supposed to drop into Drop Zone C. The entire regiment minus the 3rd Battalion, which was going to go into Drop Zone D, closer to the Douve River. Their job was to help seize those bridges, help the 501st seize the bridges over the Douve, and basically seal the airhead against German counterattacks. Now, also part of the 501st jumped into Drop Zone C with the rest of the 506th, and they will end up taking part in the fighting around Poopville, and Causeway number 1 becomes very important because that mission was actually supposed to be for the 1st Battalion of the 506, but because they're so scattered, they don't actually get there in time, and it's actually the 501st that ends up liberating the town and opening up Causeway 1. But if you're looking at this, you can see how scattered the drops were, and really it impacts the 2nd Battalion of the 506, Robert Strayer's paratroopers, more than anyone else in terms of how this subsequent fighting around Vierville will occur, because they land all the way up north near Fouquerville, which is about 5.5 miles, if my memory is not too shot, northwest of their actual intended drop zone. So not only does Strayer have to gather all of his personnel, but he's got to move them down towards their original missions, which were the causeway number 2 on Saint-Marie-du-Mont. the seizing of that town. So they've got to gather up everyone, and he's literally walking through the middle of the 502nd's drop area, which is how they got there mostly because those serials of the 506 end up honing in on the 502nd Pathfinders, and that's why they end up dropping all the way up north in drop zone A. So that's basically where we sit in terms of the airborne plan. As for the regimental headquarters and Colonel Sink, Robert Sink, they end up dropping right on the dime because Colonel Charles Young, who's the pilot of the lead aircraft for the serial carrying the 506, he's when you're the lead aircraft and you're the lead dog, you have the easiest run. You're not trying to watch out. You're not trying to stay on somebody else's wing. You're the one who's basically the quote unquote pathfinder. You're the one who's setting the tone in terms of the flight in, and you've probably got the easiest flight in because you're not trying to stay in formation with anyone else. Although you have to monitor who's behind you, as you know, you're responsible for the rest of the air crews behind you, especially as a commander. He commands a wing. Anyway, but that's where it stands in terms of the airborne plan. Um, but we also want to look at the enemy because this is not a one-sided fight. And I learned a long time ago you bring a lot more to the story when you carve up both sides of the fight and present them as they are and who they are too. Instead of having a nameless, faceless enemy, you now have an opposition. And in this case, we're well acquainted with this particular command, the 91st Luftland Division, commanded by General Lieutenant Wilhelm Falle, of which the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment under Major Friedrich von der Heydte is under, and they are part of the 84 Corps under Erich Marx, General the artillery Erich Marx. Now, Marx is famously depicted in The Longest Day. He had lost a leg in combat, but he was a very capable corps commander. And as many of you know, he requested his senior unit commanders to take part in war games that evening. So Falle is actually down at the war games, and by the time they figure out that the paratroopers are dropping, he gets in his car and he heads back to his command. And as many of you know, he ends up running into paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne, Malcolm Brannan, and he ends up getting killed in an ambush. So right away for the Germans, you have a layer of command that's taken out. So this is going to cause confusion. But ultimately, Marx, von der Heydte and Marx will communicate as they know each other because Marx has toured the battle space and he has met with his subordinate unit commanders, and he is well acquainted with von der Heydte. So once, but really the main enemy force that the Americans are going to be faced against are going to be paratroopers of the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment. In particular, the 1 Battalion, led by Hauptmann Emil Prekschat. He's the commander of 1 Battalion. He is very aggressive, dyed-in-the-wool Nazi, and an experienced paratrooper. And it's his men that they'll end up fighting against. Now, his battalion is made up of 4 companies, and unlike when Reg and I were discussing the Fallschirmjäger that took part in the fighting during the Battle of the Bulge, these paratroopers are much more well trained. Some of them are actual paratroopers that actually jumped out of planes, which you still can't say that for a lot of them, but they also have a strong cadre of NCOs and officers, and they're very young and very well indoctrinated. And based on their table of organization, they're also flush with automatic weapons and Panzerfaust and Panzerschrecks. They don't have a lot of heavy weapons. They do have 8-centimeter mortars in their mortar sections, and they are organically supported by, or inorganically supported by, artillery of the 191st Artillery Regiment. Now, for the Americans, we're looking at 2 distinct units here. We're looking at the 506 Parachute Infantry Regiment. Again, I don't have to go over these in detail because many of you who've followed the pod are well acquainted with Colonel Sink and Colonel Strayer and his 2nd Battalion. made up of a D, E, F, and his headquarters in the 2nd Battalion. But also you have the 746 Tank Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Clarence Hupfer. He's the battalion commander, but really want to focus in on his Company A, led by Levier Hedges. He was the commander of Company A, and they're the tank company that is going to take part in the fighting at Vierville. They run standard M4 Shermans. They'll come ashore at Utah Beach, and we'll get over that when I start going over the overview for the fight here. Now, a brief overview is going to cover actions on the 6th and 7th of June, okay? So on the 6th, obviously you have Strayer and his men landing up near Fouquerville. You have Sink landing down close to Couleville, which is where he'll establish his initial headquarters. And you have 1 battalion of the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment ordered up towards Saint-Marie-du-Mont. And again, Von der Heydte is down near Carentan, and they've already captured some paratroopers of the 101st. So they're already aware that the paratroopers are landing, and that this is most likely the start of the invasion. And he is phoned by General Marks and ordered to deploy his regiment from Carentan all the way up through the rear to the rear of the 709th Regiment up near the coast, right near Utah Beach. This is the unit that's defending Utah Beach. He deploys his entire regiment as instructed, with the 1st Battalion ordered up to the northern edge of Saint-Marie-du-Mont to form a blocking line and relieve pressure on the troops of the 709th. Specifically, he's supposed to combat the paratroopers that are landing behind the positions of the 709th, and then support them as the landings progress during the day. They'll have on-call artillery support from 4 Battery of the 191st, as I explained before. But as that battery is positioned and ready to start supporting one battalion, they begin taking naval gunfire from the landing force, and it actually is directed right onto their positions, and they suffered 21 casualties, mix of wounded and killed, and it forces them to withdraw. And unfortunately, they become a non-player in the rest of this engagement, including the one at Vierville. And this is going to severely hamstring 1 battalion because they won't have their artillery support. So it's organic weapons only. And this is going to put them at a disadvantage, especially when the 746th Tank Battalion comes in to support the 506th. By the time they move up to the 1 battalion moves up to Saint-Marie-du-Mont, Prickshot found that he already had elements of the 101st have captured much of the town. And not only that, they're starting to see reinforcements from the 4th Infantry Division have come ashore at Utah Beach, penetrating southwest towards the town as well. Not only that, he's also starting to see glider elements. At the time, he starts to dig in his men and in the south and southeast of the town. He can't eject the forces out of the town as it is, but there will be intermittent fighting that goes on around the edges of the town all the way through D-Day. Now for Sink ends up landing very close, within 300 or 400 yards of his intended area that he was supposed to drop near Couleville. So he's able to make his way, after a short period of time, down to Couleville and establish his headquarters there. Now what's really interesting is it took him a couple hours to figure out where they were. Like I said, he was only a few hundred meters away from his CP. But he gathers over about 40 members of his regiment at that point. But he doesn't have really any communications with his battalions right now. It takes him a little while, but he finally establishes communications with Lieutenant Colonel William Turner of 1st Battalion and orders him to clear the area around Causeway number 1 down to Couleville. Now, I don't think Sink is aware at this point that Poutville has been taken and Causeway number 1 is open, but Turner does exactly as he's ordered. And by 1000 hours on D-Day, Sink still hasn't gathered much information or many more of his troopers, and this is really frustrating for him. He has no idea if the 3rd Battalion has captured the bridges over the Douve. He doesn't know if the 2nd Battalion has opened up Causeway number 2, and all he knows is his 1st Battalion is working its way back towards his command post from Causeway number 1 area. As a result, he decides to make a bit of a recce on his own. So he commandeers a Jeep. There had been a Jeep from the 81st Anti-Aircraft Anti-Tank Battalion in the area, and it was driven by Private George Roden. He decides to go on a little bit of a recce, like I said, to find his 3rd Battalion. He needs to talk to Lieutenant Colonel Wolverton and ascertain whether or not they've been able to seize the bridges over the Douve. So he gets his S3, Major Harold Hank Hanna, and he grabs 2 troopers to ride shotgun on the Jeep, Privates Amory Roper and Private Salvatore Siniceros. They're both armed with Thompsons. Hanna has his revolver and a box of grenades. Roden has his carbine across his lap, and Sink has his revolver as well. The two privates sit on the Jeep, and basically they're holding on to the hood is the windshield is down. They're holding onto the windshield, and they have their other hands on their Thompsons. So it's pretty precarious situation for those who are driving. And Roden can't really see around the two very well, so it's kind of slow going at first. Now, while this is happening, 1 battalion under Prickshot starts pulling back from Saint-Marie-du-Mont towards Couleville and Vierville, but they're way east of it in the fields. And they finally get some elements of the battalion around Couleville, around Vierville, actually. So Roden noses the Jeep out of Couleville, and he makes a quick right onto what's now the D424E1, which is that sub-road. When you look at it, it kind of looks like a horseshoe against the 913, which heads northeast to southwest. So as you look at it, it looks like a big horseshoe where Couleville is located. So anyway, Roden pulls out of the compound and drives down that road right towards the T intersection at Vierville. Makes a right, and they go a bit further, and they actually run into troopers of 1 battalion, paratroopers of 1 battalion on both sides of the road, but everybody's kind of in shock at first. Hanna sees a German trooper stand up, point his rifle at him, and he starts firing with his pistol. And it's basically all hell breaks loose. The 2 privates on the hood, Roper and Sinicera, start firing with their Thompsons and knocking down Germans on both sides of the road. But the Germans are also diving in ditches and running through the hedgerows to get away from the incoming fire. Sink's firing with his pistol as well. The Jeep careens all the way down towards Agdeville-aux-Plaines and then turns around. Roden finds this little dip in the road where he's got a little room to work with, and he actually turns around, and they basically repeat the pattern straight back up through the German positions and all the way back into Couleville. And this has been nicknamed Sink's Wild Ride for the longest time. But none of the men on the Jeep are hit. And when they pull back in, I mean, there's adrenaline is pumping. They're laughing and you know, they can't believe they've survived. And Sink sees the box of grenades in the back of the Jeep, and he looks at Hanna and he goes, "Why the hell didn't you use those?" And Hanna kind of shrugs his shoulders, and they laughed it off. As this is occurring, a company of the 746 Tank Battalion, which had landed around 11:40 hours on Utah Beach, and they'd cleared the causeway and several approach roads. By 1800 on June 6th, they have bivouacked near Saint-Marie-du-Mont. Now Sink, he gets about 75 troopers from 1st Battalion of the 506 make their way into the area around Couleville, and Sink is really kind of buoyed now because now he's got that force. And then a little bit later, after the fight around Brecourt, Strayer shows up with about 200 troopers or so. So now there's about 350 troopers of the regiment there. So Sink is a little bit more happy because now he's got a force that he can work with. You know, he's got what he considers a substantial force. A lot of the stray troopers, even ones that aren't even part of his regiment, get put in this kind of scratch force, and they're basically told to dig in around the south side of Couleville. So there's kind of like this ellipse to the southwest of the farm complex, where you have strays from the 501st and you have 506 guys, plus you have, you know, you got all these different, even a few 82nd men are in the scratch force there. Now, as Strayer arrives, they basically designate Company E as the regimental reserve, and they're pulled in close. And I remember talking to a couple of them. And if you go into Couleville, there's a hayloft, a barn with a hayloft, and there's where a lot of the a lot of the Easy Company men spent their first night in Normandy. Now, there's lots of things that go on before nightfall that happen to the regiment. Um, One of them is the loss of Ed Peters. Ed Frosty Peters is the captain. He is the headquarters company commander for the 506 Regiment, and they are taking intermittent sniper and machine gun fire into the farm complex. So Peters makes the decision to go take out a position, and he's unfortunately killed uh, during this engagement. And I want to read. This comes courtesy of Mark Bando, who and the Peters family, a letter that was written by Sergeant William R. Shorty Myers, who served alongside Ed Peters, and he wrote to Ed Peters' wife and said that Captain Peters died instantly and with no pain. He had been as close to his men as a brother. He always had a cheerful smile and a helping hand or helpful advice for anyone who was troubled. His engaging smile was too strong to be eliminated, even by gunfire and death. Now, there's some other stories that Mark Bando had come upon about Ed Peters, and I highly recommend you reading about them. They're ghost stories. They're very engaging and interesting stories. I won't tell them here, but to say that the loss of Ed Peters was a terrible one for headquarters company and the men that served with him. Now, that wasn't the only thing that happened during that time. Apparently, as one battalion was pulling back from Saint Marie du Mont, they were kind of they're feeling their way around where all the paratroopers are and trying to find their way back south. They've been ordered to withdraw back, and so it's kind of nowadays they call it meeting engagements. They're basically bumping into small groups of paratroopers. So you're having these little sharp firefights between small groups of men. And at one point, now this also comes courtesy of Mark Bando, that John Reeder, who is a lieutenant and a communications officer uh, on the in headquarters company of the 506, Reeder said at one point he had personally taken the Germans under fire, German paratroopers under fire with a 30 caliber, and he said what was really interesting with it was that Sink was feeding belts of ammo into the gun for him. Now, Bando tried to follow up with Reeder about it, but he really didn't get the full story, and unfortunately, but I mean, to me, that's just an amazing thought when you think about Colonel Sink sitting there next to one of his lieutenants, and he's taking the cloth belts out of ammo cans and he's feeding them into the gun as Reeder pops the feed tray open. Sink is laying the cloth belts of ammo into the chamber, and then they're slamming it down, racking it twice, and they're engaging these German paratroopers. One other thing that does happen, and I think a lot of Band of Brothers fans and Easy Company fans already know this story, but it happens here. That the what's depicted in Band of Brothers when Winters goes out and prays to thank God for getting him through D-Day. What really happens is he comes out of Couleville and he actually marches up D424E1 back north and east. And as he gets to the turn in that road going back towards the 913, he actually hears the hobnailed boots of the Germans and he has to dive into the bushes as these Germans walk by. This is how close the two forces are to each other during this time frame. And I don't know how much that story has been circulated. If you've read the Major's biography, you obviously know it. But this is where it takes place. Um, so at that point, you have these two forces. They're doing two different things, but they're both going in the same direction, right? You have the Germans who are withdrawing, and then you have the Americans who are advancing, and they're both basically heading southwest, and they're both on different sides of the 913, with one battalion in the fields to the east of it, and then you have the Americans coming in, mostly road bound, but they're also coming in through the fields down towards Couleville. Again, one battalion of the 6th Fallschirmjäger has lost their artillery support, so they are they're severely hamstrung at this point. Preakshot decided it's time to withdraw. He starts pulling his guys back. He knows he's got low ammo. His casualties are building. He doesn't really have a way to treat them beyond basic first aid, and he can see the gliders coming in, bringing in supplies and reinforcements. At this point, he knows he's in trouble. He's in trouble. He's in danger of being encircled. And so, again, they begin their fighting withdrawal to that southwest. They're spread out all across that eastern, in those fields, the eastern side of the 913. And it's been a really herky-jerky 48 hours for them. I mean, they've been told to deploy, so that it's been a movement to contact all the way up to form that was blocking positions, and then they're digging in, and now they're withdrawing, all within a 48-hour period. So you got a lot of adrenaline going. You're wasting a lot of energy in digging position. Well, it's not wasted because the position keeps you alive. But I mean, they're being jerked around a lot, and the guys are these Fallschirmjäger are expending a lot of energy and adrenaline, and then having the adrenaline drop, and they're moving up and then back down again, and so and they're being engaged in these small firefights all the way back down. Now, also what's happening is before the 746 Tank Battalion can even join the 506, D Company of the 70th Independent Tank Battalion had landed on D-Day. They get pushed down first, and they are ordered to link up with Billy Turner's 1st of the 506. Now, this group gets together, and before they can be engaged by one battalion, and I think a lot of this happens because it's kind of very early light. I don't think the Germans are aware of what's going on. Once I think Sink's Jeep ride kind of alerted them to the fact that there are Americans on the opposite side of the 913th, so they generally have pulled back across the 913th. So instead of being on both sides of the road in ditches, they have withdrawn into the fields. So 1st Battalion of the 506 and D Company of the 70th have kind of a clear lane to head down. Now, Turner's ordered to head down towards Beaumont. So he does that. He and the D Company folks move out very early, but by 08, that movement is all happening. And again, this is not a singular event. The Sink also has orders to move up the rest of the 506, and they're going to have to pass through Vierville as well. But what they don't know is after that initial column heads out, Preakshot's paratroopers start to filter back closer to the 913, because they do hear. It's not hard to hear these are mostly M5 Stuart light tanks with D Company in the lead, but it's not hard to notice when those tanks are rumbling by. So they start to move up in those early hours after that first column takes off. Sink and Strayer have no idea. I mean, they know there are Germans in the area, but they don't know they're in force. And with the 1st Battalion moving out and passing through the area, they're under the impression that it's unguarded, essentially. At about 09, A Company of the 746, minus its 1st platoon, moves out through Saint-Marie-du-Mont down to Couleville, and they're ordered to link up with the 506 and support their advance. So we're early on the 7th. The D Company A Company, specifically 2nd Platoon of A Company, the 746, moves out. They're commanded by Hugh Jones. But they're led by the company commander, Laver Hedges. Now, he's in the lead tank. Now, when they get down to where the D424E1 is, they make that right off of the 913. Remember, I described it as like a horseshoe. They make the right onto the horseshoe, and the intent is that they're going to drive over to Couleville, where Sink's headquarters is, link up with him and his men, and then they're going to move out towards Vierville. But as they get to that point, they make the turn and they go in a couple of 100 meters. They run into several wires strung across the road. Now, it's never explained, and I've read through the 2nd Battalion 506 AAR, and I've read through the 506 AAR after action reports. They do not state that they laid the wires. So very possible that Preakshot's paratroopers put those wires there to decapitate Jeep drivers. But Hedges and his men don't know if those wires are attached to explosives or anything, so they decide to back out, back to the 913. So they reverse the column, basically backs all the way back out of the 913, and then begin driving down to the 913, figuring that they'll go down to Vierville, they'll make the right, they'll head up to Couleville, they'll pick up the 506th, and then they'll come back down to Vierville. But what happens is Hedges' tank gets ambushed about 700 meters from Vierville. They get hit by three. He says the after action said 3 anti-tank rounds, but they didn't have any anti-tank guns, so it's likely Panzerfaust or Panzerschrecks that hit the tank. The coax gun is destroyed. The main gun is knocked out, and they suffer a partially broken right track. It's not enough to disable the tank, though. The bow gunner opens fire to cover the withdrawal of the column, and they basically push all the way back to Saint-Marie-du-Mont, where Hedges swaps his tank back out for one that's not damaged, and they basically turn around and head right back to the fight. Prickshot has got to know that this is not going to be the only attack that his unit is going to withstand. So again, I fully believe at this point he starts to push more and more forces towards Vierville. He knows that they're going to use the 913 to traverse, so he has got forces arrayed on both sides of the 913th at this point, fully intent on either ambushing the Americans as they come down the 913th or as they come out of Couleville down to the T intersection in Vierville. What's interesting is he radios back to his battalion. He radios back to the regiment, and basically sends that 5 enemy tanks were destroyed, but the battalion is now surrounded. Very interesting to me that he says that there are 5 tanks destroyed, really when there's only 1 tank that's hit and it's able to move out under its own power. And we're gonna see more tank on infantry action coming, but still there's no 5 tanks destroyed. And I don't know if he's just making a guess at this point, or if he's attempting to buoy the morale of his men and headquarters by saying that they accomplished more than they actually did. Strayer doesn't want to wait for the armor to get back from Saint-Marie-du-Mont. He feels like he can push out of there and advance to Vierville. So he has Easy Company step off. Now, in the interim between the initial engagement, where Hedges' tank is knocked out, there's this quiet time, I think, where Prickshot has not had a chance to fully deploy all his men around Vierville. And it's during this brief interlude where the column for 2nd Battalion steps out from Couleville with Company E in the lead, and then Strayer and his jump command post in trail. And the rest of the battalion is supposed to follow in order, with the 2nd Battalion headquarters, then Dog Company, and then Fox Company. Company E and the battalion jump command post make it all the way through Vierville and basically head down towards Angeville au Plain, intent on catching up with the back of the column of 1st Battalion. So you have the battalion column is now bifurcated into 2 elements. You have Easy with the battalion jump CP already past the intersection in Vierville, whereas the rest of the battalion column is trying to close up the distance. Now, Bob Williams, who's a radio operator in 2nd Battalion headquarters, he's monitoring his nets, and he received word on his net that the lead company, this would have been E Company, that the town of Vierville was clear. Now, this is strange. Like I said, there must be this weird interlude before Prickshot can deploy his paratroopers on both sides of the D913. For some reason, they lose. Like I said, they must have sprinted out before the rest of the column could get there, but they end up making their way through. The 2nd Battalion is now being led by Major Oliver Horton, who's the S3 of the battalion. He's in command in the interim, while Strayer is forward with the rest, with the lead elements of the battalion. That interlude is when apparently Prickshot ends up filtering his men back in there again, like I said. And he hits the seam perfectly between the two elements of the 2nd Battalion 506. He manages to make he gets his men to infiltrate through into Vierville between the elements. And at that tier intersection, he strong points, essentially. He sets up machine guns to fire down towards the T intersection from northeast up to the 913th. And you can basically see, when you look at it, the intersection here, and you can see the town of Vierville as you make your approach. The road, the D424E1, nowadays it still has some hedgerows, but they're not nearly as tall as they were in June of 1944. Many of the troopers said that they were like between 8 and 12 feet tall, including the trees on top of them. So you really couldn't see what was in the fields bordering the area. But what you could see, as you got to about 150 to 100 meters away, you could see the buildings in the town of Vierville from the approach. If you're looking at this on YouTube, you can see the picture. This is a modern day shot of the road leading into Vierville. Now just imagine those hedgerows on both sides, much taller, and it's early in the morning, so you're not, it's 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning, so you can still see, but it's not nearly, your view is not nearly as clear as you can see right here. Now, as the 2nd Battalion headquarters makes its approach to Vierville, they're taken under fire by that German machine gun that's positioned up the 913, firing down towards Vierville. They make their approach. Now, we're going to spend some time. The original genesis of this entire presentation, including when I did it for Woody, was I had been researching Benjamin Stoney, who had been a member of Easy Company. He's for those of you who are familiar with the pictures of Company E during the march to Atlanta, you'll remember the picture of DeWitt Lowry with the puppy dog lashed to his musette bag. But one of the troopers in that photo is Ben Stoney. And Ben Stoney was always interesting to me because he eventually gets recruited by Lou Nixon, who's the intelligence officer he's the S2 for 2nd Battalion headquarters. He is well acquainted with Stoney. He had been an assistant platoon leader in Company E in the 1st Platoon, of which Stoney was a member of. He was well acquainted with him. Stoney had a very high IQ. He was also very fit. He was also a very conscientious soldier. He was an early NCO in the company, and Nixon specifically recruited Stoney for the S2. Now, S2 personnel nowadays are generally intelligence personnel. You're there as an analyst. You're there to analyze the enemy order of battle and their current disposition and feed it to the S2 officer, who, in conjunction with the S3 officer, works with the commanding officer to make decisions on how to deploy his troops against the enemy. But back in those days, the S2 section was made up of analysts and scouts. These guys they used like a reconnaissance element of the battalion. And so Stoney was also, in addition to being an analyst, he's also a scout. So he had been moved he was up at the forward elements of the battalion when they made their approach into Vierville, and he was there when the machine gun opened fire. Now, I've talked to a lot of Easy Company guys about Stoney that were there and went through Toccoa with him. Beg your pardon, just grab a sip of coffee here. Bill Garnier said Bud was a great trooper. His nickname was Bud. He was a great trooper and the nicest guy you'd ever meet. He was tough as nails. Dave Webster, who was a member of the 2nd Battalion headquarters at the time, Bob Williams, who was the communicator I mentioned before, who had been radioed that the town was clear, and then Charlie McAllister, who was also in 2nd Battalion headquarters. McAllister was actually up with Stoney in that lead group when the machine gun cut the road. According to Webster, the fight at Vierville was slow to build, and this is something that other veterans of this fight echoed. The battalion had advanced towards the town and began taking machine gun fire from the church tower. So what you have now is you have a machine gun firing down the roadway into Vierville, and you have the church tower, which is positioned on the east side of Vierville or the southeast side of Vierville, this allows for an interlocking field of fire. It allows you to bring fire down, so you just don't have a single element of fire. It makes it much more difficult to attack when you have interlocking fields of fire being directed against you. But anyway, you have it also from an elevated position, so they have the ability to see down with a commanding view so they can direct their fire more accurately. Fans of Saving Private Ryan, you'll remember the machine gun position in the church tower in the last battle there. Uh, think of that as your reference point, as your visual reference point. They have a machine gun mounted up there, and they're taking that intersection under fire along with the machine gun that's positioned up to 913. Webster said rounds were impacting all around him as he crouched in the ditch. His platoon leader, Frank Reese, who was the light machine gun platoon leader for 2nd Battalion headquarters, repositioned the machine gun teams in the ditch on the opposite side of the road so they wouldn't be visible to the church tower machine gun position. Very smart to do that. Those hedgerows, remember, they are a plus and a minus on the battlefield. They restrict your vision into the other fields, but they also provide you concealment, which is exactly what they're doing here. According to Webster, a couple of the men had moved into the adjacent field. There are a couple of openings to the fields on both sides, and there's houses on both sides of that road at the T intersection. A couple of the men had gone in there and found a barrel of Calvados, and were filling up canteen cups when that machine gun in the church tower started firing. Guys are scattering everywhere. Calvados is flying everywhere. But the Germans are visible, and Webster remembered the rate of fire building up on both sides. And he remembers his company commander, Lloyd Cox, who was equipped with a grease gun, banging away with his grease gun until it jammed. And then he vividly remembered Cox trying to clear his grease gun while he was yelling, "Kraut troopers, they're dug in along the road. Kill them. Kill the sons of bitches." So those of you who have read Parachute Infantry have read this before. You've seen this before. So I thought it was really interesting. But when you layer it with the other accounts, you get a much more complete picture. At that point, Webb sees Stoney break from cover and was immediately hit by machine gun fire. He called him the popular Stoney, spun around from the force of the impacts and dropped, his Thompson clattering on the road. Williams also witnessed Stoney's charge and subsequent death. He heard the machine gun open up as well. Stoney had been walking lead scout, according to Williams, maybe 30 to 40 feet ahead of the group that Williams was with when he was hit. He felt the Germans had better fighting positions than the GIs since they had cover. They were using the hedgerows while the Currahees were road-bound, and at the time of the initial burst. Stoney was killed, and then all heck broke loose, according to Williams. Charlie McAllister, who I mentioned, was up forward with Stoney and that group. He said, "Stoney, myself, and a couple of other troopers took cover behind the corner of the fence while we tried to figure out what to do about the Kraut machine gun, which was holding everything up." See, I don't even know, based on Charlie's recollections, I don't even know if he could see the church tower machine gun firing down on them. Also, the church tower machine gun might have been firing down on the troopers who were trying to retrieve the Calvados. So now you've got that interlocking fire is sort of broken. It's not broken by American fire, but it's broken because there are multiple targets now. Anyway, McAllister continued, "I don't remember Stoney saying anything. He tossed a hand grenade from the cover of the stone fence in the direction of the gun up the 913, and then charged it with his Thompson submachine gun blazing. It didn't work. The German machine gun, as we would now say, blew him away." It's at this point it becomes a wild melee here at the intersection, the T intersection. You also have the other companies of the battalion, of 2nd Battalion, arrayed behind them. They're road-bound at this point, but now they're given orders to start to fan out. Now, for Dog Company, they'll end up fanning out on the left side of the roadway, and they'll enter those fields and start taking the Germans under fire on the opposite side of the 913. For Fox Company, they become more of the supporting element in this fight, because they are trailing the 2nd Battalion headquarters. And the 2nd Battalion headquarters deploys itself as an infantry unit. And they start fighting that way. Instead of acting as a command and control element, they start fighting as an infantry unit. Now this is going to knock out some of the command and control, and becomes a little bit of a, like I said, a wild melee where the units are just kind of flailing at each other. And for those of you looking at this on YouTube, you can see pictures of Webster and McAllister there on the lower right. Webster continued his narrative here, and I thought it was really interesting. He said, as this was happening, Staff Sergeant Merle Hogue deployed one of his machine gun teams in the courtyard where the men had been getting cups of Calvados. According to Williams, Hogue was able to find a pigeonhole in the courtyard wall and had the gun team firing through it at the German machine gun in the church tower. So now that German machine gun's being engaged by another machine gun. Unfortunately, as that GI machine gun, as that 30 caliber started peppering the church position, Webb saw a potato masher arcing over the wall. He didn't see the impact or the explosion. He heard the explosion and saw a cloud, a black cloud, emerge from that area. And then Hogue stumbled back through the opening in the hedgerow, bleeding from a wound in his head. A couple of members of the headquarters committee grabbed him and started pulling him back. And then a medic grabbed him and evac'd him back towards Couleville. Hogue's wounding was like a signal to the rest of 2nd Battalion headquarters. The entire company explodes in fire. They are engaging, seeing a member of the company wounded and seeing Stoney killed really had this galvanizing effect on the men of the 2nd Battalion headquarters. And they all start blasting away at the German position. Horton sends a runner back towards the regimental command post. He needs tanks. He knows that they're not going to be able to outflank these German positions and weed them out of the hedgerows, and they need firepower. So he sends back a runner to get the tanks. Richard Red Falvey, good friend of mine, I spent a lot of time with. Red was a great character, native New Yorker, railway man, big Yankees fan. Red said, we started down this highway alone and came to the village called Vierville. One or two of our companies were out ahead of us, and I was in the headquarters company. Now, again, this shows you the difference of recollections from the men. And a lot of these recollections are anywhere from 60 to 80 years after, well, 60 to 70 years after the action. So memory is not too sharp. So again, I tried to get as many first-person accounts and weave them together as much as possible. But anyway, Red said, quite a firefight had started to take place. They were firing from the other side of the road and we were firing back, but not really seeing anybody. With the hedgerows, they couldn't see us as we were pretty much covered completely. It just kept growing and growing and getting worse as the time went on. Eventually, 2 tanks arrived on the scene. They aimed their 75 millimeter guns and 50 caliber machine guns on top of the hedgerow, and they just poured it on. Firing those 75s and the 50 caliber guns at what? I don't know. I never actually saw a person. Finally, white flags went up, and it was the German 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment. Now, we'll get back to Red's story because I want to talk more about the tanks as they arrive on the scene, because they become the critical component to this fight, and they really turn the tide of battle. And again, it's A Company. The 3 tanks in the fight, not 2, like Red said. You have Captain Hedges in the tank, Staff Sergeant Kelton Rainey, who is the platoon sergeant for 2nd Platoon A Company, and then you have Sergeant George Cox also commanding a tank in 2nd Platoon. Hedges' tank was in the lead, followed by Sergeant Cox, and with Staff Sergeant Rainey's tank running trail. When Williams first heard the sounds of the lead tank, he and the others in his little group started to get a little scared. They thought it might be German tanks, but as soon as they saw that big white star on the side of the tank, they were buoyed by the presence, because they knew this was some firepower coming on their side. The 75 millimeter guns, like Red said, started smashing the German positions and soldiers. Cox saw several soldiers blown into the air. When he started using his 30 caliber, he would use it to punch holes in the hedgerow and then fire he'd use it like, in his words, he used it like a chainsaw to open up holes in the hedgerows. And before firing they fired a large round from the 75 millimeter through that hole. And again, he could see the German paratroopers kind of flying through the air as the 75 millimeter anti-personnel rounds and HE rounds were exploding in the hedgerows. He said, I fired the 30 caliber to break those holes through the hedgerows because it wouldn't prematurely detonate the 75 millimeter round. It allowed them to penetrate through the hedgerow and explode on the far side, instilling more casualties on the paratroopers. And I want to credit this next part to my friend um, Tim Potter, who did a bunch of research on this, and he traveled to Vierville um, and spoke with his friend Roger Delaroque, who lives in that area. They were able to speak to Claude Godard, who was a 7-year-old at the time when this fight took place. Now he was hiding in his family's chicken coop as Cox's tank began firing, exchanging fire with the German soldiers. Now a lot of this is Claude's words. Um, Several German soldiers were hiding behind the next hedgerow. When Cox saw the Germans pointing a Panzerfaust at his tank, it was too late. The first round hit the Sherman tank and took out Cox's periscope, burning his face and eyelids with hot metal fragments. And he had also fragments buried into his scalp, his left eye, his hands, and his arms. Partially blinded, he reached down for another. Uh, he reached down towards to rotate the periscope when another round violently shook his tank. The third round killed his gunner and best friend, Arlen Wilson. The fourth and fifth Panzerfaust rounds knocked the remaining men of his tank crew unconscious. With no response from his men and believing they were dead, Cox jumped out of his tank and blindly staggered down the road. An American paratrooper, pointing a rifle at his face, questioned him if he was from the knocked out tank. Cox replied that he was indeed from that tank, so the paratrooper quickly put him in a ditch for his own safety and called for a medic. Dog Company is now moving up on that flank, right? We talked about how they were outflanking the T intersection. Richard Gleason, who was a member of Dog Company, said we started out down the road towards Vierville, and then sometime mid-morning they spread out into a skirmish line into the field off to the left and proceeded to make a move, he called a movie advance, all on line, spread out, firing from the hip. They advanced on line approximately at right angles to the road, and we found vacated positions in several harnesses, having caught in the trees and the hedgerows. We received some fire on the right as we moved across the open field. Louis Trox, who was another D Company NCO, said we moved out, and I believe my platoon was in the point because we approached the intersection from the left, and it sounded like 3 Kraut machine guns opened up all at once. So as they were moving up, they could hear that initial burst of fire that killed Stoney, plus the fire coming from the church steeple. It, all we had for cover was the ditch on the roadside and the hedgerows in the field. The machine gun bullets were coming so close. I later found 2 places in my helmet where the rounds had burned into my camouflage netting. There's an interesting part of Frank Innes, who was the D Company supply sergeant, was crawling next to Trox, and he basically handed his M3 fighting knife next to Trox, and he said, "Hey, Louis, do me a favor, cut a hole open in my breeches. I've got to answer the call to nature." But the machine guns must have been eliminated, according to Trox, or else they pulled out. Anyway, we decided on a frontal attack from the hedgerow to hedgerow rather than going down the road. We spread out from the right side of the road, which is actually the left side of the road, and moved out. Well, it's the right side as you're looking down the 913. The tops of the hedgerows were being covered by thousands of screaming bullets, but it was almost impossible to see any real live Krauts. We advanced firing from the hip, and I remember seeing 3 Krauts on my left running to get behind another hedgerow. John Rice from Walnut Ridge, Arkansas, shot all 3 in the back with a long burst from his Thompson. Now, Fox Company was on the opposite side they were moving down the road as well. They basically became the supporting fire element for the attack. John Taylor, who was in Fox Company, and he wrote an extensive biography of his time during World War II, had this to say about the engagement. About the crack of dawn, a column was moving up the road, and a big part of it was 2nd Battalion. I got back with the company early that morning. So Taylor hadn't even made his way back towards his company until that point in time. On that morning, we began moving towards Vierville, which was the first village we came to in the direction of Carentan. I was on the left flank of my squad going through the hedgerows. Along the road, there was a little firefight going on in Vierville, not much. However, moving through these hedgerows was a challenge and nerve-wracking situation, since you didn't know what was on the other side or behind each one. When we got into Vierville, I was mighty thirsty. In the center of town, there was a little churchyard. There was a big house across from it, and a lot of people standing around. So I went over to see if I could get a drink of water. About that time, a couple of our troopers double-timed some German prisoners out and up the road. Then from somewhere in that group, I don't know where, a grenade fell on the ground. I saw it, heard it pop, so I knew it was live, and I yelled, "Live grenade." I made a quick dive behind a fence and think everyone else did too. I had about a 5-second fuse and no one was hurt, but I know it must, so it must have been a concussion grenade. Had it been a fragmentation grenade, we would have had some casualties. This woke me up fast, and I may have forgotten all about the water too, because right after that, a firefight broke out. Some guy had gone up to the second floor of one of the farmhouses and spotted a bunch of Germans down in a gully and opened up on them. And it wasn't long before we had 20 or so German prisoners. It was then that Taylor spotted Stoney. Just as we moved into town, Sergeant Stoney was machine gunned down and torn up badly in the chest area. He was already dead and laying in the street when I got there. At that point, so clearly, at that point, so early in the action, his body would have just been moved over to the side of the road. It was not practical to do anything else. Now, based on Taylor's recollection of it, there was a like it wasn't a singular action. It was more like some lulls or peaks and valleys in the action. But with the church tower still having that machine gun position in there, um, it's still a pretty formidable defense. Even if that position, the machine gun position up the 913, gets knocked out, you still have the church tower machine gun covering all of the fields and the approaches up towards Vierville. Now, according to Gordon King, who was a radio operator and many times acted as Lewis Nixon's radio operator, he remembered seeing his platoon leader, Pete Baranowski, jump up on one of the tanks. He was climbing up on the tank and he was screaming at the tankers to fire a canister. Canister, he kept yelling, and the tankers weren't firing the canister rounds at that point. So this might have been before Cox's tank started firing, or before Cox's tank got knocked out. But anyway, Bob Williams also saw Baranowski up there. He said, "We heard a tank approaching. It was one of ours. We pointed to the church tower, and with one shot, the tank blew a big 3-foot hole in the tower, knocking out the machine gun. Our platoon leader, Lieutenant Baranowski, climbed on the tank and grabbed the butterfly handles on the big 50 caliber machine gun. He manned that gun like a madman, killing Germans left and right as fast as he could shoot. Williams felt with the arrival of the tanks the tide began to turn in their favor. Pretty soon white flags were being raised from the German positions. Horton, seeing the white flags, decides the Germans are about ready to give up, but Baranowski was ignoring them. He kept firing and firing and firing. Finally, Horton was yelling at Baranowski to cease fire, but Ski was obviously in a rage. Horton eventually moved up to the side of the tank, pointed his 45 at Baranowski, screaming at him to stop firing. That did the trick. Baranowski ceased fire. The Currahees began disarming the German prisoners after the white flags came up, and many were surprised to find that the survivors were a lot of them were between 16 and 17 years old. Now, according to Gordon King, uh, the 1 battalion suffered 140 killed and they took 150 prisoners approximately. And he said they had 1 man killed, which was Stoney, and 4 to 5 wounded. The 2nd Battalion after action report said 1 KIA and 6 wounded, one of which was the assistant mortar platoon leader, Bob Brewer, who would go on to be a platoon leader in Easy Company during Operation Market Garden. Robert Schurter, a dog company operations sergeant, said my group ran into 150 German parachutists. They were badly outnumbered, but after the desperate fighting, we captured the remaining ones. Now, again, remember these are uh, the recollections were given in different times. Schurter is quoted in an article soon after their return from Europe, I believe post-war, or at least post-Normandy. King did his interview, I want to say in the early 80s, for a newspaper article. And Bob Williams did several interviews over time and was interviewed by the World War II Museum. And Bob Williams said, we captured about 125 of them, but if it was up to Lieutenant Baranowski, we wouldn't have captured any of them, but that's war. The 746 Tank Battalion after action report said there was 100 prisoners taken. So it depends on whose after action report you read about how many were taken. Still, there were a number of men from 1 battalion and Preekshot himself who continue their fighting withdrawal southwest on the 8th. They're able to move into the fields and kind of get away from the 506 as they continue to advance. They're continued to take under fire, and they end up just moving towards. They're trying to reach the safety of Carentan, where the regimental headquarters was. Um, they finally make their way back, but they're kind of caught between the 501st at La Barquette and the locks over the Douve. And at that point, the 501st takes them under fire, and finally, um, Prickshot surrenders the battalion. Unfortunately, they end up getting hit by friendly fire, and Prickshot goes MIA. I believe he was killed during the engagement. Um, the battalion is essentially wiped out, and what few were left, they get taken prisoner. And so, I mean, um, there's really no word that filters back to von der Heydte what happened to his first battalion until 3 Battalion under the command of Lieutenant Stenzel gets back. He reaches Carentan and he's able to tell them what happened to the first battalion, which is essentially wiped out to a man. Um, and this is it's a when I talk to the men of the 506 about facing the 6th Fallschirmjäger, they had a lot of respect for them as fighters. They thought they fought very hard, and again, they didn't have anything beyond their organic battalion weapons. Uh, and when you go back and look at the ledger for the battalion, they had 9 officers, and 6 of them were MIA, 2 were KIA, and only 1 survived. So really, those MIAs obviously KIA. So 8 of 9 killed in action and 1 survived. Now for the second of the 506, once they finally clear Vierville, they make their way down to Angeville, a plain, and they reach there by 4 o'clock in the evening, and they hunker down for the night. And this gets turned into Sink's second command post there. And again, Company E is placed in regimental reserve, and the rest of the battalion, 2nd Battalion, is deployed around Angeville. And for those of you who want to learn more about the fighting around Angeville, I highly recommend a copy of Woody's Angels of Mercy, or you can check out his episodes on it. And like I said, if you want to see if you want to watch a good follow-up to this episode, I highly recommend that Dead Man's Corner episode that Niels did with Woody. It's an excellent follow-up. But anyway, that's pretty much it for the fighting around Vierville. Again, very confusing, especially when you start pulling in all of those. You start pulling in all of the accounts from the different troopers that were involved with it, and some of them are not necessarily matching up very well, and you have to sit there and deep dive it and look at the terrain and look at the different accounts and finally weave it all together. And I thought it was just such an interesting fight because unlike accounts you read about Easy Company or Fox Company or Dog Company, this had the whole entire battalion involved, and I wanted to make sure that we give some credit to the other members of the 2nd Battalion, because Easy does get a inordinate amount of press, and these men fought just like Easy Company did. They were the same battalion. They fought in a lot of the same fights, and to get their perspective on some of the fighting to me is very valuable. And having known several of them was also just fun to be able to bring them into the forefront and have their story told a little bit. For next episode, we're going to have Sam Wallace come on. Sam has written a book called Lighting the Torch about the torch landings and subsequent fighting in North Africa. I'm really excited to have Sam come on and discuss his new book. Having done a couple of episodes on North Africa, it's a fascinating topic for me, especially when you have that initial American entree into the fight against the Germans. But you also have the Allies learn how to be allies there and not always successful in doing it. And I'm really looking forward to Sam. Also, I've reached out to Patrick O'Donnell about coming on and doing an episode on the OSS and maybe talking some Army Rangers as well, which will be kind of cool. But thanks everyone for following along. I apologize. It's a little clunky at times when you have to work from a script, but I really wanted to make sure I quoted the men properly. So, and I know I was repeating myself at times in terms of the flow of information in terms of the battle. But it really, again, just an interesting fight, a very intimate tactical level fight. These are the kind of fights I like to bring out for my listeners because I like to intersperse the accounts of the men that were involved. And it's easier to do that in a tactical level fight instead of bringing like this the broad font with the big arrows. Reg and I joked during that Battle of the Bulge episode that it was basically the overview, and there's going to be some episodes coming where we're going to just talk about the men and their actions, and those are going to come, all dependent on Reg's schedule. But those are the kind of stories we like to bring out here, and I hope everybody's enjoying them. Please leave comments or send emails. You can get us on we're not lost private at gmail.com if you want to email comments or ideas, or if you've got more information that I might have overlooked. I've always loved to find out new things. Please feel free to reach out or hit me up on Patreon, on our website. You can go in there and leave comments as well. But thanks again for everybody, and thanks again for our new supporters. Look forward to catching up with you on our next episode. Bye.